Please be seated. We gather today not to celebrate one life, but two interwoven lives, a partnership. Gordon and Jane didn't die at the same time. Gordon passed away in the spring of 2020, when we were just emerging from the first wave of COVID and memorial services, like all large gatherings, were strictly avoided. And Jane died about 10 months later, when vaccines were rolling out and people were re-emerging from isolation. And those were heady, optimistic times before the Delta variant crushed our dreams for a speedy return to normal. But Gordon and Jane were scientists through and through, and they were also humanitarians, and the last thing they would have wanted would have been for their memorial service to be a super spreader event. And so here we are now, more than a year after Jane's death, finally together in person to honor two lives dedicated to science, family, understanding, and the life of the mind. Sadly, I never had a chance to get to know Gordon or Jane, but in speaking to their children and friends, I have a sense of how rich and full their lives were. He was a diehard humanist, especially in his later years, and she was something of a mystic. They both were voracious readers, as evidenced by their library of thousands of books. He preferred history, science, and the history of science, and she loved science fiction and fantasy. She was vivacious and made friends easily, and he had countless colleagues, students, and admirers. At a time when women were discouraged from pursuing degrees in science, she had a master's in physiology. He was a preeminent psychiatrist and medical educator, winning prizes and nicknames and formal titles like the Mark Twain of medicine, or even a formal title, believe it or not, the medical czar of Oklahoma. She cooked meals in which she wove together her knowledge of chemistry with a great love for her family and guests. And he dared to climb precarious ladders to put up elaborate Christmas decorations and built magnificent wooden fortresses for his sons. Even it meant struggling to sink 15-foot tall poles into cement foundations in the middle of the rain. They were two very different people, and they were partners in life. In preparing for today's service, I came across a video that the two recorded back in 1989. It's called "In the Beginning Was the Face." It's easy to find on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend it to you. The video begins with a close-up of Gordon with those wonderful sideburns, saying that a famous book says that in the beginning was the Word. But, he asks, does your sense of you begin with the Word? Did my sense of me begin with the Word? In our beginning was feeling. The beginning of you was your face. The beginning of me was you seeing my face. Gordon then introduces Jane as his partner in marriage and professionally. And the two proceed to offer a deeply compelling presentation on the meaning of body language. Before watching this video, I knew that they were both incredibly intelligent. What I didn't appreciate was their amazing acting skills. Jane's depiction of a man-spreading, scowling, slouching man is something to behold. The typical memorial service involves a lot of words. Words about what a person accomplished in life, where they came from, where they lived, and where they went to school, and where, when, and sometimes how they died. But for all those gathered here today, especially those who were closest to Gordon and Jane, including their family members, Chet and Sharon Deckert, and Carl and Lori, and grandchildren, Eric and Anjali, and Ariel Jane, and Casey Greg, and Jason, and Jane's sister Tenna Kay Bradshaw, and her husband Bob, and Jane's niece Roxanne. I invite you not to focus exclusively on the words, but to remember the faces of Gordon and Jane. And remember that beyond their intelligence, their accomplishments, their gifts, and their failings, in the beginning was feeling. Above all else, there was love. I'd like to invite Jason Deckert up to do a reading.
On children. And a woman who held a babe against her bosom said, "Speak to us of children." And he said, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And although they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable." Thank you.
Remaining seated, would you please join me in singing hymn number 6 in the gray hymnal, "Just as Long as I Have Breath."
Still
like to invite Carl Deckert up for the eulogy.
Thank you for coming. Okay. And thank you for it being Memorial Day. And for all those that served. And Jane and Gordon both did that. So, my name is Carl Gregory Deckert. I'm the second born son of Jane and Gordon. The best and most memorable eulogies I ever heard were from my father. What huge shoes to fill, but I'm going to try to give it a shot. Now I'm going to try to channel a little bit of Dr. Deckert. Funerals are for the living. A sentiment that Jane shared, but with a little more empathy and a little less volume. What did they mean? How are funerals for the living? I'm hoping as we go along, it'll become a little more clear. Gordon and Jane could not stand eulogies that turned the person into some kind of unrecognizable saint. With this in mind, I'm going to focus on their journey together as a couple, because that was the most important, enduring, memorable and influential part of their life. So Gordon Harmon Deckert was born in May 1930 into a Mennonite community in Freeman, South Dakota. His father and mother and his whole community were into education. And his community, especially his grosspa, valued this country and the Constitution. My dad, as a boy, would listen out the window of their local farmhouse, their family farmhouse, and Grosspa would pray to God in a kind of personal way, like it was his friend. And it would be a mix of English and German. But Grosspa, in every prayer, would thank God for this country, and especially that this is a place you could worship as you saw fit. Peggy Jane Chu was born 8 months later, grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, to a family that valued education and also valued hard work. As children, they would both be profoundly affected by illness. Gordon saw his mom suffer from asthma, struggling for breath as he was a kid, and as a little boy, he vowed he was going to grow up and help his mom fix illness. He also became very driven by that fixation to tremendous professional success. But part of that drive would come back to haunt him in the twilight of his life. Little Gordon was also intrigued by his Uncle Kermit. His Uncle Kermit was different. His Uncle Kermit talked different, acted different. And sometimes Uncle Kermit would be in a strange hospital. Later on, Gordon would learn that his uncle was a schizophrenic, and that was a family secret. That was something the family was kind of ashamed of. And Gordon would spend a huge chunk of his life fighting that stigma. Peggy Jane's experience with illness was more personal. As a grade schooler, she was struck down with what she described as brain fever. And she became paralyzed on one side. She was sent off to be with her aunt and uncle. But as a little girl, she didn't understand why. But her parents, this in the Depression, needed to work. She slowly learned to speak, read, and write again. But that sense of abandonment, not being able to talk and communicate, and the fear of illness was part of her. yet very much under control. But it overwhelmed her with a terrible wrath towards the end of her life. In the summer after my dad's junior year in high school, to help his mom's health, the Deckert family, moved from South Dakota to Las Cruces, New Mexico. At that time, Janie was a rising senior, and she was the belle of her high school. Brains and looks all wrapped in a package that the boys definitely noticed. Gordon was the new senior, and he was working out with the high school football team, and all the girls were at Twitter about this new boy arriving senior year in high school. While practicing football, Gordon started to hear about this lady, Janie. Something special. And the high school football players talked about her as like she was something special. When Gordon first saw Janie, though, she wouldn't pay him the time of day. No attention at all. And she told me years later, well, he was getting enough attention already. So Gordon had a solution to this. To get her attention, on the front steps of the school, Gordon picked up a book and smacked her right there. Almost knocked her down the stairs. Janie turned around enraged. And that was something that Gordon would experience more than anyone else on the planet. Perhaps to set the tone of their life together. Two very smart people, two very strong-willed people, who would spend the rest of their lives together. But wow, could they fight? Words, gestures, occasional slam door, until the dementia started. Gordon and Jane would date, starting in high school through college. They'd get married in June 1951, just before heading off to medical school at Northwestern. And I just learned last night, apparently her dad insisted on that. These turned out to be tough times for them. Real poverty. For entertainment, they would watch the rats on the fire escape just outside their little apartment. My brother would be born there, and his first crib was a dresser drawer. Later on, Janie would become a medical physiologist, a sex educator, a philanthropist, and a patient simulator, as we just heard about. And wow, could she act. Whoa. They both professionalized medicine, and they both talked about part of that choice stemming from their childhood. But no matter how much they professionalized healthcare, they would still be thrown when it came home to them and to their family. Gordon and Janie became a power couple, from Northwestern to the Mayo Clinic to the Air Force, finally to Tinker Air Force Base, then to the OU Health Science Center, teaching medical students, medical research, the National Boards for Medicine, Planned Parenthood, national speaking engagements, redesigning medical school curriculum. And towards the end, Gordon with Jane took on the state of the health of Oklahoma. Both of them always teaching, helping each other, being the closest of confidants, and keeping each other in check. Gordon always going out into the world, seeking to fix illness, often succeeding, and always craving public attention. Janie, the glue of the family, seeking to keep those she loved healthy and happy, often succeeding, and always fighting so that none of her own ever felt abandoned. But what were they like really? What was the character of Janie Gordon? I've spent the last week talking to family and friends, listening to what they had to say, and this is some of what I heard. Gordon, proud, but in a Mennonite sort of way. Wise. The smartest guy in the room, and he knew it. An astounding teacher, a leprechaun, mind-boggling, insightful, dedicated to his family, dedicated to his work, perhaps too dedicated. Reserved. He never had friends, just colleagues and students. Kind, mean, profane. Usually with a purpose. Usually with a purpose. And Janie, gracious, a great lady. What a presence. Wicked smart, adventurous, intelligent with empathy. An energetic and vibrant soul. Trusting. Yet she would hold a grudge and feud with neighbors for years. What a figure. Kind, mean, profane, in a Chew sort of way. When they were at their best and in their prime, they were the most incredible power couple I have ever encountered in my entire life. They complemented each other, they built on each other's strengths, they helped each other through their weaknesses and their faults, and helped them compensate. I knew this my whole life, but didn't realize just how much until the decline started. And then I asked about prominent memories. I heard so many, but I'm going to leave that to others. I'm going to leave that to my brother, and to my wife, and to my aunt. But I will say this. First, Gordon. He was doing TED Talks before TED. With titles like, Sex is not a four-letter word, Life in the Global Village. You already heard, in the beginning was the face. And perhaps most famous, The Psychological Journey of a Medical Student. Outrageous, theatrics with a purpose. You already heard he was called the Mark Twain. That was in print of medicine. Oh, he hated that. But boy, did the lessons stick. They certainly stuck with me. Janie. The most consistent message I got about Janie from multiple friends and family is she had a superpower. She could listen with empathy and be the most captivating person to talk to, and could talk to anyone. And they would be profoundly engaged with her. It was incredible. And the realm of that would be from her family, her grandkids, friends she just met. We just heard kind of a racy story last night that I'm not going to repeat. But that was really kind of almost her superpower. Okay, what did Gordon and Jane hold sacred? This church. When they first came in and first worshiped here, they were in tears. Because it was a place they finally felt at home. Education and learning. Scientific knowledge with emotional insight. People who could change their mindset based on evidence. The beauty of their home, beauty of their family, and perhaps most of all, life. How about the decay? It began with Janie about 20 years ago. Started with short-term memory, then fear, and never wanting to be alone. And then over time, much worse. And then ultimately, towards the end, better. Gordon had a new mission. Something to fix. Taking care of Janie. It was beautiful at first. Marvelous, loving. But then came his own health issues and his own dementia, and the stress and exhaustion and impatience and anger started to come out more and more. Lori and I intervened over and over. And ultimately, in 2017, we found the Heaven House. Thank God. Lori will talk about that a bit more. But I will say this about their twilight. Janie, when we first took her to the Heaven House, she was scared and confused. She couldn't talk very well. And Lori and I were leaving that first day, finally having to leave. And Janie spoke out as clear as a bell. Tell my mommy where I am. Gordon. He had a medical emergency and finally had to face his decay. I was alone with him in the emergency room. He began crying unconsolably and muttered to me several times, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I said, "Dad, what for? You have nothing to be sorry about." And he said in a tone that is etched in my soul, "I'm so sorry for getting old." So to paraphrase Gordon, what are memorials for? They are for sharing grief and for saying goodbye. Memorials are also for celebrating. Gordon and Jane had a crackerjack of a life. They would want us to celebrate. Indeed, funerals are for the living to celebrate the lives of those they have cherished. But funerals are for something else too. My dad said that strange things happen at a good funeral. In death, the person who has died somehow or another becomes a more complete person because we learn more about them through each other's eyes, the good and the bad. We learn things about them we didn't know, and I have this week. In a strange sort of way, if we notice, if we dare to grieve and say goodbye, we say hello to a person that is even larger. So there's something else to notice. I look around at family, friends, colleagues, and students of Gordon and Jane, and I see them among us. I see their legacy living on in us who teach it to others. They are gone, but they live on in us. So Mom and Dad, we are saying goodbye, yet in ways we hadn't anticipated. We are also saying hello.
Check.
Well, I'm Chet Deckert, the eldest son. My first memories are of 804 East Bouse in Midwest City, a little house in a so-called working class neighborhood that also had quite a few poor people. I believe that I learned later that my mother wanted to move, and she wanted to move badly, but my dad insisted that they were going to pay all of his medical school debt first. One of my very first memories is teaching my brother, who was still in diapers, how to climb the backyard fence. I wasn't allowed to open the gate, but I told him it was just like crawling. And I put his little hands in the loops of the fence and then his little feet, and up he went, and I helped him throw his leg over the top, and he climbed down, and then he just took off. Well, my mother came out in the backyard and said, "Chet, did you open the gate?" I said, "No, it was Mr. Innocent." And then she said, "Well, then how did your brother get in the front yard?" And I said, "He climbed the fence." So I began to learn just how much freedom and trust our parents had in us. It just went on and on. The first thing was I was told that from now on I could play in the front yard with my brother, but I was to make sure that he stayed in the front yard. So I told him not to touch concrete because that worked. He couldn't go on our driveway, he couldn't go on the neighbor's driveway, and most definitely not in the street. But he wasn't all that interested in doing those things anyway. He wanted to climb our tall front tree that was in the front yard. So I picked him up so he could reach the first branch, and up he went. Now he climbs mountains. Well, little did I know, we did a lot of things in that front yard, including moving the dog out there for a while with a rope. And little did I know, my mother could see it all. I thought we were doing it all in secret. She could see everything from her kitchen window. But she never said a word until years later when she started telling stories. Well, when I was still quite young, my parents came to me and asked me if I wanted to go on a trip with my father. I was like, okay. Well, it was one of his speaking tours. And you can imagine as a little child how amazing it was to fly from city to city and see him give speech after speech and watch the audience riveted to their seats. You could hear a pin drop. It was just unbelievable to me. He would portray people with different mental illnesses and body language. Well, after my 4th grade year, we moved to a nicer neighborhood. I didn't like it very much. Bouse had a huge number of children. And when we were at Bouse, I would bring a lot of them sometimes into our house. And my mother was a perfect hostess. She would show up with sandwiches and candy and Kool-Aid, and it was something else. Anyway, we moved to Woodvale, and you've heard a little about my father and the fort that he built. I think that must have been a tradition in his family. He built one for us at Bouse, and then he decided when we were at Woodvale to go colossal. He bought 4-inch by 8-inch by 15-foot long beams. And they became the corners of a 3-story fort. And I haven't seen anything like it ever again in my life. We had an absolute blast. I told my father that it would be great to have a rope from the very top of the fort down to the ground. And we found that if you ran really hard, you could swing up very high and clear our backyard fence and drop off in the neighbor's backyard. And the neighbors didn't seem to mind. Well, my parents' career. My father taught freshman and sophomore medical students. He taught psychiatric residents. He obtained the chairmanship of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, and he was the youngest person to ever obtain that position in the history of the department. One day, my mother and I went to go see him in his office. And as we walked through the parking lot, we got to the area that was doctors parking only. And there was Mercedes, BMW, etc. And then we get to his premier parking space, and that's our old Ford 500. He would keep that car going, it seemed like forever. And he drove it. He would not buy a new car. And I inherited it when I was 16 years old, and I kept it going for years and years. His office was huge and impressive. Multiple governors, both Republican and Democrat, appointed him to the Oklahoma Board of Health. He took speaking tours, and as it has been alluded to already, my mother would often join him on the stage, and she would portray different mental illnesses with different posture, body language, and tone of voice. She was amazing. My father was a handful of physicians who wrote questions for the national license exam that all physicians must take. He became a David Ross Boyd professor. Now, I'm not even sure what that is, but that was one of his honors. We moved eventually, after my 8th grade year, to Oklahoma City. And it was a ridiculously large house. And we had a large library with more than 3,500 books, which I assumed he read all of them. He kept winning awards, just one after another, until there was no more room on the library walls to put any more awards on the wall. After I finished college, I went to medical school. I didn't stay there, but I went. And he was one of my professors. The other professors had an attendance in their classes of just a handful of students and quite a few tape recorders. My father's classes were always packed. And he quite often, on his speaking tours and even in his classes, got a standing ovation. I have to talk a little bit about the face business. He rediscovered something that hardly anyone knows. Charles Darwin wrote a paper. I believe it was a paper, not a book. I think it was entitled "The Primary Emotions of Primates and Human Beings." These primary emotions, we are all born with. One of the things that Darwin said is he considered that paper, that work, to be more significant than his Origin of the Species. The primary emotions are acceptance, disgust, surprise, joy, fear, anger, sadness. We are born with them, and they all remain a core of our being. My father used them in therapy, and they each have a unique facial expression. And my father would name the muscles in the face and which ones were contracted, etc. Well, I quit medical school, and my father was upset. He could get angry. So I went to work, and I worked for quite a while, saved my money, and went back to school. He forgave me for quitting medical school. I didn't want to be a physician. I got a master's in mechanical engineering, and I was hired by NASA to help design the space station. And he was so proud, he would embarrass me to death bragging to people. He was very proud of my brother as well, but he couldn't brag about him because he was 007 at the CIA, and it was top secret. Well, I did not see my father before his death, but I did see my mother close to hers. I got close to her face with mine, and I said, "Mom, it's Chet, your firstborn son." And she was lying there stiff. But she nodded ever so slightly, and I noticed it, and the nurse noticed it. And then I said that I was 65 years old, and I would go on with my life, and I would be okay. And she didn't need to hang on anymore. She died 2 days later. So, when I imagine heaven and what I would like, I think of the little house on 804 East Bouse, and my brother is there with his wife and children and their wives, and my wife is there with my children. And the airplanes from Tinker Air Force Base keep rolling over our house, which I just loved. My mother didn't, but I did. And there's baseball in the street and football in someone's front yard. And we explore what we call the woods, a square mile of absolute wilderness, with vines and a swamp and a dump. It was paradise. And there's my mother's whistle. Her whistle was like a foghorn. I felt like you could hear it for miles. And it was always telling us that it was time to come home. And God help us if we didn't. So, that's all I've got to say.
I'd like to invite up Lori Deckert.
Hi, I'm Lori, and I've been a Deckert since 1985, when I had the blessing of marrying Carl and joining Jane and Gordon's family. I'm grateful to have just a few minutes tonight to share some memories I have of them, and in some way small, to honor the role that they played in my life. I was immensely blessed to be born into a family with a mother and a father who loved me dearly and taught me the essential lessons of right and wrong and a good work ethic and how to love others well. What I didn't expect in my life was to marry into a family where I would gain a mom and a dad who taught me equally essential lessons. And primarily what they shared was how to live and embrace a healthy adult life, all of your life. As I think of what I learned most from Dad, Gordon, it was that there was an expectation in our family that we would continue to grow and to learn all of our days, every stage of life until the end of our life. And the second thing that I would learn from him as he told stories and I absorbed his wisdom and I listened to him talk and share with our family at dinner time and in the living room was that the most courageous work we can do as human beings is to face the personal inner demons we have and to transform that into a healthy way of living. And he was very passionate about that. When I first married into the family, he would ceremoniously introduce me as, "This is our daughter by our son's choice." After I became the mother of two of his grandsons several years later, he would introduce me as, "This is our daughter by our choice." The last year of his life, after he had invited me into the most private parts of his life, into hospital rooms and doctor's offices and even the bathroom, I was sitting with him one day, and he was rather reserved in general, but he reached over spontaneously and he took my hand and he said, "Not by anybody's choice, you're just my daughter." And then in this beautiful, humble way, he said, "I hope that's okay with you." And I said, "Oh, of course, Dad." And we both wept. One of my last memories of being with him. When I think of what most impacted me about my relationship with Jane, with Mom, was an experience that happened actually the night before I became a Deckert. It was at the rehearsal dinner that she and Dad threw for Carl and me before we were married. And they had orchestrated a beautiful ritualistic ceremonial event for the rehearsal dinner. And at the end of the ceremony, Jane brought Carl to me at the head of the table, took my hand, put his hand in mine, and said, "I've been the primary woman in his life for 27 years. Now that role goes to you. He is yours." Never, ever in 35 years did she interfere, intervene, impose her will on our marriage. And the one time I went to her and asked early in our marriage, "Mom, we're having this issue, what do you think?" She said, "You and Carl will figure it out. Never intrude." And that really has become the inspiration for the kind of mom I want to be to my son's partners as they come into their lives. At the end of their lives, and Carl was speaking to this, we had the difficult decision of moving them into an assisted living facility when they could no longer care for themselves. We were so blessed to find Diane Cooper and the Heaven House. It was a small, intimate, assisted living facility where Mom and Dad could stay together. Because of Mom's dementia, if we had put her in a larger facility, she would have been in a memory unit. Dad would have lived separately, and they would have just torn them apart. So we were very blessed to found the Heaven House. And there are 5 ladies in particular I'd like to recognize because they're the ones who gave the care when we were unable to be there, when we lived in Virginia and weren't able to come. It started with Miss Elizabeth, who came in and took care of them while they were in the final months of living in their home. She was there 24/7. She came in with the strength to face Gordon Deckert, and that was a formidable task. And she did. But she did it with joy, with grace, with incredible nurturing, and really made the transition more seamless for all of us. When they arrived at the Heaven House, Shell is the manager there. She had everything beautifully orchestrated, again with very appropriate boundaries for Dad and with a lot of love for Mom. 2 caregivers that were especially close to Mom and Dad were Shanna and Glenda, both of them joyful, loving, calling him Dr. Gordon, always respectful, giving them tremendous love and service. And then lastly, Shatia, who was there when both of them each took their last breath, so they were not alone. And I cannot thank you, ladies, enough for the gift that you've given our family Know that you will always be in our hearts and part of our family story. Namaste.
And finally, we'll hear from Tina K. Bradshaw, Jane's sister.
Peggy Jane Chu Deckert was my big sister. She had a fundamental impact on my life. Our brother called her PJC. Essentially, I was an accident and stole her birthday because our mother made sure I was born on her 13th birthday. We celebrated our birthdays together each and every year, no matter what, even after she and Gordon moved to Heaven House. Jane was outgoing and an overachiever. One of her chores was to dress me every morning, and she managed well in spite of my protests. Our brother Matt was Jane's baby brother. She told us once that she worked hard for quite a while to figure out how to kill him when he was a baby. They never got over their sibling rivalry, and he is probably still trying to make her scream in heaven. And he could do it. Our brother Matt had a speech impediment as a small child. Jane was able to understand him and frequently interpreted for him. One day, when Jane was mad at him, the teacher asked what he was saying. She answered, "He wants to throw you in the crapper," which was a correct translation. When Jane was 8, she contracted encephalitis. In 1939, there was very little that could be done for a child who was that sick. Parents and aunts and uncles stayed at her bedside 24 hours a day, feeding and hydrating her with an eyedropper. She survived, but she could no longer read. She dragged one of her feet. She was able to overcome all of this with the constant oversight of family and her incredible ability to persevere. She managed not to lose a year of school. This experience had a strong impact, forming her personality. There was no tough job that she wouldn't tackle, including being married to Gordon. In high school, she was active in band. She played the alto sax. She participated in our International Order of Rainbow for Girls and was a grand drill leader. She was also elected as the Malay Sweetheart when she was 16. When I was 3, she saved me from a childhood trauma. I was left upstairs for a nap. When I woke, I realized I could not go down those straight, up and down Victorian stairs. She heard me and came to my rescue. It's an experience I will never forget. She went down the stairs with me, riser to riser, scooting on our bottoms, so I wouldn't be afraid to go down the next time. when Gordon started dating Jane, he also wooed me. I made him promise not to get married and not to marry her, but he had to wait for me. As a 3-year-old, I would sit on his lap while he taught me to play Peter, Peter, Pumpkin Eater on the piano. After Peter, Peter, Pumpkin Eater, he taught me to count to 10 in German. I can still do it. When Jane and Gordon had to take care of me for an evening, Gordon's bribe was a hot fudge sundae if I behaved. If I didn't get one. That was Gordon's way. Our brother Mac was able to get under Jane's skin by taking Gordon's picture from her bedroom and putting it on the back of the toilet. He did it every day. He always called Gordon that sauerkraut-eating Dutchman. And Jane got back at him because he had a Catholic girlfriend. In order to get to college, Jane needed transportation. Our father had kept a Model T Ford, which he got running. It had to be cranked to start it, which required a person in the car and another at the crank. Every morning, Daddy or Mac got it going, and every evening, she had to find a college boy to start it so she could come home. Gordon was always busy with his classes, so he couldn't do it. Surprise, surprise, Jane never had any problem finding a boy to help her start the car. During college, both Jane and Gordon were active in the Presbyterian Church. Gordon planned to become a doctor, and Jane planned to become a lab technician, medical physiologist, and they were going to be medical missionaries. When Gordon was accepted at Northwestern in Chicago, Jane wanted to go to finish her degree in lab technology. Daddy informed her that she wasn't going unless they got married first, period, which they did. Gordon had the ability to make a celebration special. When we visited them their first year in Chicago, we went at Christmas so my mother could make sure they were okay. I was 8 years old. Gordon took Mother and I to a restaurant in Chicago, which was the first time I ever ate Chinese food. Didn't know it existed. He ordered me a special dessert. I still don't know what it was, but it was delicious. And I wanted more. And he said he couldn't afford it. So I didn't get any more. After Jane became certified as a lab technician, she got hired by the Veterans Administration to do research in cancer. She trained cats to sit in a sling upright so that she could put electrodes on their paws. You know the old saying about herding cats? Jane could do it. Jane once told me that when she was in Chicago, she decided to be adventurous one day and go without underwear. She said she felt like the sidewalk had eyes. She never did it again. She did get her master's degree in medical physiology. Jane dressed up and put on her makeup and her jewelry every day. She told me she wanted to make sure her husband, who worked with professional women all day, every day, could come home to a professional woman who was prettier than they were. Because of my interest in linguistics, Gordon talked to me about his work with facial expression and body language. I was able to use this extensively when teaching high school English. It helped me have understanding with students about the nuances and the impact of language, and especially body language. This became known, finally, as microexpressions. I feel strongly that Jane should have been a doctor because of her childhood illness and her ability to empathize. She was able to reach out and touch people. She always referred to herself as a fixer, but in reality, she was a caregiver. She made people feel safe, happy, cared about. She was able to do this in her fertility planning, her work with Planned Parenthood. They were quintessential to who she was as a person. On a personal note, she and Gordon saved my daughter's life. In New Mexico, my daughter Roxanne was diagnosed with a possible stroke. When talking to Gordon, he insisted that she come to Oklahoma for a diagnosis because he trusted the doctors at Oklahoma University Hospital to arrive at a correct diagnosis and treatment. Roxanne was diagnosed with a brain tumor. She had 3 surgeries, and Jane nursed her back to health, which took 24/7 care for about 5 years. Jane also cared for my niece, who had fibroid tumors and was told she could never have children. Gordon again said, come to Oklahoma and be seen by the doctors he trusted. Because of the treatment Karen received here, she was eventually able to have children. My son and grandsons both describe Aunt Janie as the best cook in the world. I'm going to hazard a guess that everyone agrees with that. She was a wonderful hostess and a gourmet cook. I miss being able to go to visit she and Gordon, where they made me feel so special and welcomed and loved. Gordon called me Tenny Gay. And I felt like I was his little sister. Jane and Gordon impressed me with their class, poise, and their acceptance of me and my choices. They helped me survive the bad choices and celebrate the good ones. The impact of their love gave me the safety and security to be who I really am. Finally, they offered that same safety and security to everyone in the family with Jane's Crazy 8 1-800 number, which I used more than once. Who could afford long distance? We all were given the opportunity to be impacted by Jane and Gordon's generosity and love.
So as you know, both Jane and Gordon were scientists, both professionally and in their hearts. And so it seems appropriate to offer as a meditation an adapted version of a text by NPR commentator Aaron Freeman. You want a scientist to speak at your funeral. You want the scientist to talk to your grieving family about the conservation of energy, so they will understand that your energy has not died. You want the scientist to remind them about the first law of thermodynamics, that no energy gets created in the universe and none is destroyed. You want them to know that all your energy, every vibration, every BTU of heat, every wave of every particle that was your loved one remains with them in the world. You want the scientist to tell your grieving friends and family that amid energies of the cosmos, you gave as good as you got. And at one point, you'd hope that the scientist would step down from the pulpit and walk to your loved ones there in the pew and tell them that all the photons that ever bounced off your face, all the particles whose paths were interrupted by your smile, by the touch of your hair, hundreds of trillions of particles have raced off like children, their ways forever changed by you. And you want the scientists to explain to those who loved you that they can measure, that scientists have measured precisely the conservation of energy and found it accurate, verifiable, and consistent across space and time. And you can hope your family will examine the evidence and satisfy themselves that the science is sound and that they'll be comforted to know your energy's still around. According to the law of the conservation of energy, not a bit of you is gone. You're just a little less orderly. Please join me in a spirit of prayer. Spirit of life, infinite mystery, and source of love. We hold Gordon and Jane in a great circle of honor, love, and care. Those of us who were blessed to know them offer up words of gratitude for the great difference they made in our lives and so many lives. And those of us who did not have the chance to know them personally give thanks for the ripples that their lives leave on the face of our community. Ripples that move ever outward, touching unknown lives. Would you please join me in a moment of silence to mourn the passing of Gordon and Jane, to celebrate their lives, to honor their memories. Amen. Now please rise in body or in spirit as we sing hymn number 12, again from the gray hymnal, O life that maketh all things new. After the service today, all are invited to a reception in Daniel Hall. I'll invite the family to accompany me first outside to inter the ashes into the memorial garden, and then they will be joining you in Daniel Hall for the reception. And now, may the peace which passes understanding, the peace that comes with acceptance and thanksgiving, the peace that rises above the strains of the earth, be and abide with us all, both this day and forevermore. Amen.